Hello guys, apologies for the delay on this set of notes. I ended up finishing the whole thing, but I'm still going to record 2 videos so they're not too long. I apologize in advance, my cat is feeling chatty. So let's start talking about aquatic biomes. First, let's look at where they're found. So this image kind of shows you a general overview of where they're found. Notice that we have a number of things. We have things like lakes. So there are the Great Lakes, some of the biggest ones, or among the bigger ones. We have coral reefs, which are in this lovely gray shade. We have multiple rivers. So you see here, for example, the Mississippi River. Here's the Nile River. And then you have estuaries, which are located often at the mouths of rivers. Then you have a couple of other zones. The ocean pelagic zone is just open ocean. And then you have the abyssal zone, which is very, very deep. And we're going to talk about each of these individually. And my bad, this is actually the coral reef. Moving on. So let's talk about the environmental aspects that you'll find in aquatic biomes. We're kind of used to thinking about the environmental aspects of terrestrial biomes because we live in them. But since we don't live in underwater, then let's talk about some of these. And I do not know what the cat wants. So one of the most important factors that affects where things can live in an aquatic ecosystem is the amount of light that penetrates through the water. So water absorbs sunlight, so as light passes through, less and less of it is going to reach. You have a couple of regions that are kind of named due to how much light can get through. The euphotic zone or photic zone, sometimes called the sunlight zone, is where there's enough light for photosynthesis. So that's a really big deal because without photosynthesis, you don't have any energy being brought into the ecosystem. You don't have anything to support a food chain. Below that, you have the aphotic zone, which is where you have very little, no light at all. These are kind of the deep places where you'll find some creepy things like giant squid or those anglerfish. And then in between the two, you have what's called a twilight zone. We're not going to focus on that very much. We're mostly going to focus on photic versus aphotic. So where photosynthesis can happen and where it cannot happen. Pressure is also a factor. We don't notice the pressure of the atmosphere pressing down on us because we're used to it. However, if you dive deep underwater, you'll start to feel the pressure. It'll start to constrict you and do bad things to you. And so the organisms that live underwater have to adapt to the pressure where at the depth they generally live. As you go deeper underwater, the pressure increases, usually at about 1 atmosphere, which is a measurement of pressure, for every 33 feet that you're going down. 1 atmosphere is about the pressure you have at sea level, and that's the air pressure we live in. So it's the one you'd be most familiar with. However, as you go deeper, the pressure increases, and just to kind of illustrate this, I found these neat kind of experiment things where people will take a styrofoam cup, decorate it, and then stick it a certain depth underneath the water, and the pressure compresses the styrofoam cup. So that cup at 0 meters, they took a picture of it, then they stuck it underwater at 1,500 meters underwater, and it got squished by the water pressure until it was that tiny. So that just kind of gives you an idea of the impact of pressure. Gases are also dissolved in water, and if you're thinking, wait, gases and liquids, just think about soda. Soda has a lot of gas dissolved in water. Technically, it has a lot of CO2, but there are 2 gases where you have to pay really strong attention to. One of which is dissolved oxygen, and the other of which is dissolved carbon dioxide. So dissolved oxygen is produced by photosynthesis and used by all organisms when they are performing cell respiration, which they use to break down food. It's a limiting factor for aquatic life, especially for anything that consumes other organisms. It's not as big of a factor for producers because they produce their own oxygen as well. Dissolved carbon dioxide is kind of the opposite or the flip side of dissolved oxygen in that it's used by photosynthesis, but produced by cell respiration. apologies for the yawn. It's a limiting factor for aquatic producers. If they don't have enough dissolved carbon dioxide, then they don't have enough pretty much fuel for photosynthesis. However, there is a bigger issue that when you have more carbon dioxide dissolved in water, it becomes more acidic. Just think about the last time you drank a Coke. That stuff burns a little, especially if, for example, you inhale it up your nose. That's because it's kind of acidic because of all the CO2 that's dissolved in it. In general, where water meets air, that's where you're going to have the most amount of dissolved gases, the highest amount, as well as temperature can affect it. So think about, again, a soda. If you have a cold soda, it tends to hold its carbonation better. Warm soda goes flat easier because warm water cannot hold as much dissolved gas. So here I have a nice little diagram just showing a general ocean area. I've got the photic zone identified, the aphotic zone, and then the kind of light blue that's on the water is supposed to represent dissolved oxygen. So notice it's highest close to the surface because it's coming in from the air. So a lot of the dissolved oxygen or dissolved CO2 in the water is coming from the air. You have some produced by producers. However, remember, they need light in order to produce oxygen because they need light for photosynthesis. So you're only going to have a lot of producers in that photic area. In the aphotic zone, you tend to have very low dissolved oxygen, but it tends to be high in nutrients. Why? Because if anything dies, so let's say we have a dead fish, and I know that's a crappy fish, but when they die, their bodies tend to fall to the bottom of the ocean or bottom of the body of water. They get decomposed, broken down, and that could provide nutrients for other organisms. Unfortunately, they're usually at the bottom. And only when you have all three of these things, high nutrients, high dissolved oxygen, and high amounts of light, do you tend to see a lot of ocean life or marine life. Nutrients, like I was talking about, are very important. Some of the major limiting nutrients are things like nitrogen or phosphorus. Sulfur, potassium, and sodium are also important. Those are needed in the most amounts. The most important one of those is nitrogen because it's most often the limiting factor that limits how many organisms you can support in a body of water. Then phosphorus is the second most important. Nutrient levels tend to be pretty high close to the shore or the bottom surface of a body of water, but you can also find them at something called an upwelling. It's literally what the name says, water wells up. So something drives away like the surface water, and then the deeper water comes up, rises to replace it, and it brings a lot of nutrients with it, which can help support more ecosystems. Temperature is also an important factor that can determine what organisms can live somewhere. So we've got two diagrams here. The graph on the right is showing increasing temperature going towards the right and increasing depth going towards the bottom. So notice the most shallow area at sea level has the highest temperature. The temperature decreases as you go down. Then there's an area where you have a very sharp decrease in temperature. That's called a thermocline. And then after that, you just have this steady decrease in temperature. At a certain point, it kind of stays the same. Usually doesn't quite approach freezing in most bodies of water. The other diagram is a map from NASA just showing average kind of surface sea temperatures, and you should expect the fact that it is going to be the highest in the equatorial regions around the equator. Then that's the red. The yellow is showing is basically subtropical. Then above that you have your temperate areas, and then above that you have your polar areas, and the water temperature kind of follows the same trend as you do on land. Salinity is something that we don't talk about here on land, but it's a very important factor for ocean life or freshwater life. You've heard of freshwater versus seawater. You should know not to drink seawater, and hopefully you've never had the experience of taking a freshwater fish and putting it in a saltwater tank, or taking a saltwater fish and putting it in a freshwater tank, because that would kill it. Salinity is the amount of salt that's dissolved in seawater. It's not just table salt, so it's not just NaCl. In fact, a lot of people cook with like sea salt, which has a bunch of different chemicals dissolved in it. And it can be affected, the levels can be affected by precipitation. The more water that falls, if it's fresh water mixing into something, it's going to decrease the salinity. Discharge from rivers, since rivers are fresh water, where they pour into an ocean, that's where you're going to tend to have lower salinity. And evaporation actually increases salinity, because what happens is you have a body of water. I know my water is red. And as you have evaporation happen, water evaporates, but it leaves all the salts behind. Then ice formation can also increase salinity, because ice, when it forms, doesn't tend to keep a lot of the salt in it. So it's also a matter of, in this case, you've got, ice up here, and that's mostly water, and the salt got left behind. So the liquid water that's left is going to be saltier. And in general, salinity tends to be higher in surface layers, anywhere where you have like some sort of salt source. And salinity is so important that we can actually, categorize water by its salinity. So fresh water is the kind of stuff that you find in ponds, lakes, rivers, and streams. Very low salinity. It's also the kind of water that we can drink. Brackish water is slightly salty. It's like water that you would drink and be like, oh, that's a little salty. And the ecosystems that have brackish water are places like estuaries, mangrove swamps, and you have some brackish seas and lakes and brackish swamps. Then, if you increase the salinity, you get saline water, which is seawater or salt lakes. If you've ever been to the ocean and accidentally swallowed a little bit of the water, that's kind of what it tastes like. And then the saltiest of all is briny water. So some places called brine pools, those have extremely salty water. Definitely don't drink it. Density is also an important factor, and it's going to become a really big deal when we start talking about ocean currents later on in Unit 4. Density is just the amount of stuff you have packed into a space. So one of these two diagrams has a much lower density. And hopefully you figured out that this one has low density and this one has high density. Notice that it's more dense because we have more water. And in case you didn't know, that little guy that looks kind of like a Mickey Mouse head, that's water. And we also have more salt, which are these other colored kind of circles. Those represent salts. In the more dense environment is where we have more water and more salt. We have less water and less salt in the less dense sample. So the density of water is really important, because when you have something that's less dense mixed with something that's more dense, it tends to separate based on density. And generally, for most things, solid, whatever it is going to be the most dense, but water's weird. Solid water, or otherwise known as ice, actually has a lower density than liquid water. Liquid water, notice everything's far more packed in than in ice. So what happens is when you have, if you've ever poured water in a glass and then you have ice cubes in it, those ice cubes will float. Unless they get stuck to the bottom of the glass, the ice always floats. And that's because ice is less dense. This is really important because for example, when a lake freezes in the winter, so that's my nice red lake, if a layer of ice forms on the top, it floats, and then you still have liquid water underneath where all the creatures who live in that water can still exist. You can increase the increase the density of seawater by making it colder. So anything that's colder tends to be denser. You can increase the salinity. So adding more salt is going to increase the density, or increasing the pressure, because that squishes everything. So warmer water is less dense than cooler water and it floats. and fresh water is less dense than seawater and floats on top. And this is going to affect how water moves in the ocean especially. You usually have the lowest density in surface layers of water just because anything solid tends to sink and the water temperature tends to be higher, which makes it less dense. And then we already talked about ice floating. So this is another map from NASA, and it's showing you kind of approximate densities where the darker blue is denser water and the lighter blue is the less dense water. So notice the areas where it's warmest, which is going to be in the equator, are going to have the less dense water. And these areas where there's colder water, you're going to have more dense water. And there also, you know, if you look at the pattern or the map with the salinity, you should also see some kind of correlation between salinity and density too. Tides are also an important factor, and these are due mostly to the pull of the moon. So anything with gravity tends to pull on everything else around it with any mass. And so while the Earth pulls on the moon to keep it in orbit around us, the moon also exerts a gravitational force on the Earth. Now in land, that doesn't really make a big deal because the land maybe moves a tiny bit. But water, since it's liquid, ends up getting pulled towards the moon. And so while you have the Earth rotating, this is us looking at the Earth from above. So like Asia spinning around in North America. And this is the North Pole. There's always a bulge of water pointing towards the moon. And there's also a bulge of water pointing away from the moon. This is where you have high tide. Like what you see here. This is high tide in an area. So you see lots of water filling here. These kind of areas where there's not much water, the anti-bulges, if you want to call them that, those are where you have low tide. And this is a picture of the exact same spot at low tide. This is an area with a very dramatic difference between high and low tide. And so the tide is important because it causes movement of water, but it's also important because if you've ever been on a beach, you may have seen that, you know, the water level will start rising when high tide gets closer, and part of the beach will be covered with water. And then during low tide, a large part of the beach will be uncovered and exposed to the air. This is a region called the intertidal zone, and organisms have to have some very specific adaptations. They need to be adapted to being underwater part of the time and exposed to the air part of the time. So you're not usually going to find a lot of fish in this area. You'll find things like crabs, barnacles, and things like that. So here's just a diagram showing you kind of what an intertidal zone looks like. It's the area between high tide and low tide. So this diagram is just kind of showing you halfway between high tide and low tide. But when you approach high tide, then the water is going to reach all the way up to here. And when you have low tide, the water is only going to reach to here. So that area in between is the intertidal zone, and that's the area that kind of needs special adaptations. From organisms, they tend to show something called vertical zonation, meaning they're vertically separated or zoned out. And it's not like something external is telling them, hey, you're a barnacle, you need to live up here. Oh, hey, you're a sea star, you need to live down here. No, instead, they live where they're adapted. So things that can handle being dry most of the time will be in the high tide area or just above it. Things that need to be moist most of the time are going to be closer to the low tide zone because they have to be able to they can't withstand desiccation, which is drying out. So if you're not good with desiccation, you need to live in the low tide area. Notice there's a lot of algae and stuff like that. They don't really have bones or stems, so they just fall over when they're not supported by water. Now let's get into freshwater biomes. So we're going to start looking at the ones that don't have a lot of salt in them. First, we're going to look at streams and rivers, and I'm going to put a couple of other terms in there for you. Sometimes they're called riparian zones, and sometimes they're called lotic zones. But a river or a stream is a like chunk of flowing fresh water. That's a characteristic of it. It's always moving. It can come from multiple sources. Some of it comes from like runoff when it rains. Some of it comes from underground springs. It can also come from lake water, or melting ice and stuff on mountains. But it always is going to flow downhill towards sea level, and it's going to float towards the ocean. Streams are narrow. Sometimes they're called creeks. They carry less water, and they tend to meet up with other streams as time passes and form rivers, which are wider and carry a lot more water. You also have a delta, which is where the river meets the ocean. And there's a lot of stuff we're going to talk about in our next video that happens where the river meets the ocean. So water flows at different speeds in different parts of the river. Usually near the source, the upper areas, you have a very swift current. You've got water that's moving very fast. In fact, it's so fast that it doesn't tend to have plants rooted in it. So the only source of energy is usually stuff that falls into the water. It also doesn't have a lot of sediment because that stuff's being carried downstream really fast. Then lower areas, which are near the mouth of the river, near where it meets the ocean, tend to have a slower current. You can have things growing there, you can have plants growing in there, and you usually have a lot of sediment or dirt in it, and so the water may be cloudy. You also have a lot of dirt settling out, which forms a nice spot where plants can root themselves. So here we just see kind of a diagram showing some smaller streams or creeks, how they feed together, and as they join together, they have larger volume and eventually form a river. So the flow of water is basically going that way, and that way, and that way. A watershed is the area, the physical area that's drained by a river and all of its streams and creeks and tributaries and all of that eventually drains to either a lake or a bay or an ocean. The largest watershed in the world is the Amazon River Basin. The flow of water is all in this direction, and here is its delta where it empties out into the ocean. It is a huge chunk of South America that's being drained into the Amazon and its tributaries. Ponds and lakes are different from rivers and streams because they are still bodies of water. They need to have at least some water that's too deep for rooted plants that root in the ground. So if there's plants growing all through it, it's too small or too shallow to be a pond or a lake. Obviously, lakes are bigger than ponds, and they have these characteristic zones. And before I forget, you can also call these things lentic zones. The way I think about it is I happen to have played music for a long time, and if you've ever read sheet music, anything with a lento tempo is slow. And lentic is called that. It's slow because it's not really moving. And it has 4 major zones that you can divide it into. There's the littoral zone, which is close to the shore. Usually you'll have plants growing here. They'll be performing photosynthesis, supporting a food chain. The limnetic area is the open area of the lake, so away from the shore, but it's also the photic area. So you will have photosynthesis happening here. It's usually done by phytoplankton, which are floating algae. The profundal zone is going to be below the limnetic zone. It is aphotic, meaning you're not going to have photosynthesis and you're not going to have much dissolved oxygen. So the things that live down there are mostly going to be consumers. And then the entire bottom or floor of the lake or pond is called the benthic zone. This can even include some sediment and a few layers beneath that. And you'll have, some organisms that like to burrow in the dirt. You'll have some decomposers who can pick up dead matter that falls down there. So here's a diagram just showing you these. The littoral zone is the shoreline. So notice you do have some rooted plants. These are supposed to be cattails. The open area away from the shore where you do have light is going to be the limnetic zone. So you can think of this line right here as the barrier between the photic zone and the aphotic zone. Remember, the profundal area is aphotic. You don't have light getting down there. And the benthic zone extends all the way from the shore, all the way through the deepest part of the lake. It's just all the water that's very close to the lake bed or pond bed. You do have some kind of sub areas, so you can talk about the littoral benthic area if you want to put those together, and that's going to be your lake bed at the shoreline. You can also classify lakes by how much stuff they have floating in them. Nutrients, like I said before, are a limiting factor. When you don't have a lot of nutrients, you do not have a lot of producers. So that's what I mean by saying they have low productivity. They have few producers. You probably can't support a whole ton of life here just because there's no base for your food chain. And the water's pretty clear, usually has plenty of dissolved oxygen because there's not a lot of stuff living there. In general, if you look at a lake over time, they tend to fill up, and as they get more sediment and stuff, they tend to have higher nutrients, and then you'll start to have more plants. So notice we start to have more plants, and we also have a little more variety in our animal life as well. Then at the other extreme, you have eutrophic lakes, which have high nutrient content. They have high productivity. They will tend to have a lot of algae floating in them, so they'll look green or kind of dirty. Notice you got a lot more plants growing in here. Unfortunately, since there are a lot of plants and other animals, because of all the nutrients, you tend to have really low dissolved oxygen in these, and that becomes a problem. Freshwater sources are very important because whenever you have a lake or a river, chances are good that somebody's getting their drinking water from there. For example, Texas, about 25 to 40% of our water comes from surface water, and in Dallas, we primarily use surface water. So as much as it might gross you out, we get most of our water from the Trinity River. A lot of these reservoirs, in fact, I think pretty much all of them are artificial. We dammed up parts of the Trinity River and let them kind of fill up these reservoirs, and we use those for our drinking water. There are some spots that we use for drinking water that are not attached to the Trinity, but they're kind of farther out to the east, and they're probably not going to be as large a source of our drinking water. You also can have freshwater wetlands. These are typically not a source of drinking water just because it's kind of harder to get. So these are aquatic biomes where you have, for at least part of the year, they're underwater or they're completely saturated by water. And saturated means like filled up. So it would be constantly muddy, kind of goopy. The water is shallower than a lake or a pond, so you can have rooted vegetation growing throughout. So notice this picture of a swamp. You got trees all up in it. In a marsh, you'd probably have all these grasses and stuff growing in the middle. And in a bog, you tend to have a lot of moss. These are very productive ecosystems because they have plenty of water, they have a lot of nutrients, and a lot of organisms use these. They'll use them for birds will nest there and raise their babies there. Other organisms will come there to feed. And you have three major types of freshwater wetlands. Swamps have trees. Marshes, no trees. And bogs are mostly moss and spruce trees. They're very acidic. So that's it for this first video, to be continued, and I will see you in the next video.